I fell for him. We were falling women. We believed in it, this downward motion. So lovely, like flying. And yet at the same time, so dire, so extreme, so unlikely. God is love, they once said. But we reversed that. And love, like heaven, was always just around the corner.
My defender was probably a head taller than me, and the defender made the play, but I almost got it. And I was running back to the line, and I said, when I was 30, I think I would have caught that. I think I had the jump. And everybody was like, what are you talking about? Like a year ago? And I was like, very proud.
A year ago. 100%.
Yeah. And I didn't tell them my actual age, but I took that as a compliment. And that I was athletically hanging with people in their late 20s and their 30s and holding my own. Not dominating, but holding my own. And that feels good. Yeah,
that's about what we, that is victory these days.
I would say so.
That is a really, really good spot. Yeah, I'm racing the Masters division on Wednesday of the local Criterium series. And we're gonna see what that's like.
We're gonna Masters see 40 to 50 or.
Yeah, there's a 40 plus division that I'm gonna do. Masters divisions are like wonderfully inconsistent. Like there's a 35 plus Masters division.
What
you're
the
like,
hell
what
does
the
that
fuck?
even mean?
It's
ridiculous.
I mean, like there was. Like
I was in the best shape of my life at 37. Like I don't think I was ever stronger or faster than I was at 37. I mean, partly that was that I started trying harder in my late 30s.
Yeah, I think I was similar. Yeah, I think the shape of my life was 2017. I think that was the best year that I had. But Well, speaking of like being marooned in a place that you cannot escape from, or that you just have to continue doing the thing that you're doing, like a hiking trip or a sea kayaking trip. You know.
Speaking of enduring, because that's the only option.
Speaking of the Book of Job.
Indeed, or the Book of Job.
Yeah.
As she says, do you remember that?
That's right. Yes. You're right. She
Alfred's
does call
always
it the Book
doing
of
little
Job.
riffs on words, and at one point she's talking about how like doing a job, and the word job, and she mentions the book of quote Job.
Job. Yeah. And I was wondering. I was like, is that a? I was like, I'm pretty sure that Claire Danes' reading of it is intentional wordplay in that way, and it wasn't a. Neil Stephenson Zodiac mispronunciation of the town Natick.
I'm going to guess that Claire Danes successfully, the Claire was clairvoyant, successfully read the intent of Margaret Atwood in this case. Well, we're talking about part 2 of the masterful The Handmaid's Tale.
Drink, everybody. Masterful.
Indeed.
I am.
By the way, I've decided whenever we talk about baseball, we're going to get a little baseball organ. Like da-da-da-da-da-da.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Instead of a ding, because we use dings for other things.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, we need, this is a good idea. I will start thinking about some of our other little hiccups and stuff that we can, little sound effects. I'm going to make a request for no clown horns. I don't think we should do any clown horn
or
effects.
Yeah,
Awooga.
Yeah, okay. No kazoos.
No kazoos. Maybe a t-shirt cannon sound effect is okay because really that's just
cannon,
sort of
maybe. No slide whistles.
Woo! Yeah, none of that. No.
There's some kind of there's like a cowbell on a spring that makes this kind of like sort of set like a. It's kind of a funk.
Cake uses it all the time.
Yes,
I believe it is called. I believe it is called a vibra slap.
I think you're right.
Yes.
I think we can use a vibra slap. I think we can. I have a huiro in this room.
Ooh,
right
is that
now.
the fish that you scrape?
Yeah. That's the scrapey
that's
fish.
great.
Yeah.
Okay. I was thinking of, this is great. I was thinking of Dear David Jost the other day, my high school music teacher, a giant of a man. like, talk about lucking out. I had like 5 incredible art teachers in terms of like visual art, English, drama, music. But I will never forget Mr. Jost illustrating the concept of minor and major to us. And he used the opening bars of Also sprach Zarathustra. You know, the better known as
dum, dum, bum,
dum. So
bum, bum, bum. Better known as
minor.
the Ric Flair walkout music.
Exactly. Right. Yes, of course. That is what is better known as the Ric Flair walkout music. Boy, I wish I want to have been in the writing room when that idea was hatched. Like, hey guys, have you seen this movie recently? It's got this sick overture thing. I think we could use that when Rick walks out.
I bet it was Rick's idea.
Nice.
I don't know that they had like a huge creative team in those days, but
So Mr. Jost plays the opening bars of Also sprach Zarathustra, and that opening part is minor, but as you probably know well, it shifts pretty quickly from da 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 da.
Yeah. It becomes very triumphant.
At which point, Mr. Jost stood on a chair in the music room and just yelled at us, "Major!" And I really know the difference now between, like, it was such a great moment of teaching, and that was like, what a perfect kind of text to use, right? It's slow. It very easily illustrates the way that minor sounds, and then you can really tell when it modulates into major. It was lovely.
In a lot of my podcast scoring compositions, I use the devil's interval, the diminished fifth, sometimes called the tritone. Yeah. And that there's 2 very easy mnemonics for it if you need it. And one is West Side Story.
And then the other
Maria. Well, give us the other, Chris.
Simpsons.
Indeed. The resolving.
Oh, we are children.
Both brilliant.
We're children of the 90s. My
Indeed.
God. Because you couldn't really grow up in the 80s and 90s without, like, probably seeing West Side Story like a handful of times, not in the theater, but the movie adaptation, which is fantastic.
Yeah, it's great. The original, and then Spielberg did it again. But no, it's a very good movie. The theatrical release, like, you know, great acting, great cinematography, all of that. So West Side Story, Steven Spielberg, and David Jost. And and then also Kubrick and who wrote Also sprach Zarathustra? Richard Strauss.
Thank you. Okay, I was about to guess Mahler.
I think people say Wagner. They think it's Wagner a lot of the time.
Okay, that's true. You could get those 2 confused. Both Nazis. Yeah. Both not great people.
Both inspired by Nietzsche.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well,
speaking of Nazis,
speaking of fascism.
So in the second half of the book, very quickly, we get a scene where Offred and Offglen go on a walk, and they have a moment where they basically confess their doubt in the regime to one another. And we learn that Offglen is part of the underground, and she actually says, we have a name, we're the Mayday underground, and that's our code word. You know, if somebody's in trouble, you use it. Although as Offred figures out, the eyes must know about the code word, of course. So, Offred continues to liaise with the commander. They play some more Scrabble. We learn the origin of the Latin phrase, which I don't have at hand, but sort of falsely translates as "Don't let the bastards grind you down." And then we get a flashback scene of the attempted escape where Luke, the husband, tries to escape the unnamed woman who might be named June and her daughter to basically by going to Maine and getting out, but they are caught. I love how Maine appears in this novel. And then I'll pass it back to you because it says the wedding of the angels, and I forget what that is.
That is that big the Pravaganza.
Oh, the Pravaganza.
Which there are these just wonderful portmanteaus that she that Margaret Atwood installs in
Particicution.
here. Oh my God, Particicution! What an incredible, what a great, and then the salvaging, which is not a portmanteau, but same idea. But the Pravaganza
and Econowives.
Econowives. Yeah. There are these moments where you're like, there is like very like Philip K. Dick-ish moments.
Yeah.
And that's a funny phrase, Philip K. Dickish. And
Philippian? Dickian?
Yeah, that's right. What would that diminutive be?
K. Dickian? How about K. Dickian?
I think K. Dickian. Yeah, that's because like Dickish is just not good enough.
It's too universal.
It's too. It's like.
I feel like I think K. Dickian is specific enough for our purposes.
Yeah. So we get the wedding with the angels, which I think is my favorite section of the second half of the book, because I didn't know if you noticed this, but it is the narrative thread gets really loosely woven in those like middle chapters of this section. We have a lot of like very short paragraphs and it skips all over the place. We get even some of the wedding is interspersed with the escape attempt and some memories of Offred's. And it just, the focus flits from place to place in this really very pleasant and not dislocating manner. We jump back to the Red Center. We're at the wedding. We're at Luke and Offred trying to escape. We get some previous scenes from Offred's earlier life. It really is this kind of, I just think that section in terms of craft and keeping afloat the story, even though with all the fracturing, was really amazing. And we learn a lot about Gilead during this period. We see the wives, we see the young girls who are being arranged, married off to the angels who are just back from the front. And I really think like that section felt to me sort of like the beating heart of the second half of the book. And then we jump from there to really our big plot point of the second half, which is the commander takes Offred on a trip. He takes her to a state-sponsored brothel staffed by Jezebels, women who get a few years of life in these brothels before they're shipped off to the colonies. They have sort of state-equipped uniforms. Offred bumps into Moira there, and Moira is wearing a kind of dilapidated 1980s Playboy bunny outfit. And we learn what has happened to Moira, and Offred and Moira get a chance to sort of, talk. And then we learn that Offred never sees Moira again. So we're not sure if she gets out. We sort of suspect that she doesn't. And upon returning, I think the ceremony is literally the next night after this trip, where Serena Joy moves the plot forward again. I'll kick it back to you.
Serena essentially, and I think Serena has already made this proposal to Offred, but it hasn't happened yet. Basically says, I think the commander's sterile, which you're not allowed to say. So if you really want a baby, you better have sex with another man. Serena says, let's do it with Nick, the servant, basically. Offred agrees because if she gets pregnant, she doesn't get sent to the colonies. And she actually sort of has a little bit of a crush on Nick, we understand, too. Although, is it because he's the only man in town, or is it because he's actually attractive? A little bit unclear at this point. So they do have sex in his sort of back cottage, mother-in-law or bachelor cabin in the back. There's a nice moment of flashback where Offred remembers that the listings of such apartments always used to say in the before times private entrance, which she says means you could have sex, which is exactly what happens in this particular situation. Shortly after that, we get the particicution, which is funny. I feel like my feelings towards the particicution are similar to your feelings towards the wedding, the wedding of the angels. The particicution, we see 3 women hung, and then there's a kind of gauntlet murder or killing, state-sanctioned killing, where we're told that a man is a rapist by Aunt Lydia. She reappears, one of our favorite characters from the past, to be very, to like sort of, she's now like, it's sort of like Gandalf coming back. Like she's like even more Aunt Lydia than she was before.
Let's bring out a fan favorite, everybody.
Exactly.
Everybody remembers Aunt Lydia.
And she's even meaner than she used to be. Before she was merely controlling women and training them, and now she's facilitating mass execution. They basically rip a man collectively apart, who is said to be a rapist. Of-Glen says no, he wasn't really a rapist, and she manages to knock him unconscious before all of this begins. This might be what leads to Of-Glen's fate, maybe not, but very shortly after this, actually there's something else that we need to say, which is that Offred continues to have sex with Nick, because she wants to, because she likes it, and she feels guilty about it. And during this time, Of-Glen tries to get her to help the resistance by spying, and she basically refuses. And she seems to kind of reach this point of like, well, hopefully I'll get pregnant, and maybe if I'm pregnant and I have my secret lover, maybe I'm okay. Maybe I can just
maybe
exist.
This is good enough. Yeah.
Maybe this is good enough. And she stops participating in any kind of, resistance activities. Pretty shortly after the particicution, Of-Glen is vanished, and we get the information that she hung herself, and she hung herself because she had gotten tipped that the eyes were on the way. They had figured out that she was in the resistance. And then Serena Joy learns, which was probably inevitable, that Offred has been having an affair with the commander. She finds some lipstick on her robe.
Yeah, I think the robe that she wore to Jezebel's.
The robe that she wore to Jezebel's. And Serena is angry, but then the actual climax happens, and I'll leave that to you.
Yeah, so Serena is, livid, and we hear the approaching sounds of the eyes. We hear the vans pulling up. Yeah, it's Nick with 2 other eyes who show up, and Offred at first thinks that he has turned her in, and it turns out that he is also part of Mayday, and the 2 eyes with him are part of Mayday, and she is ushered into the van, and she disappears. Whether it is, as she points out earlier, whether it's her salvation or her doom, we don't really know. But we do know from the final epilogue, which occurs about 150 years later. It's the year 2195, and we are sitting in on an academic lecture with wonderfully hilariously named people. Like Margaret Atwood does just such a great job of being like, names and language morphs over time. And so...
And a lot of wonderfully hilarious academic conference details.
Oh my God. So good.
Like the activities that they're going to engage in, and, lunchtime and things like that.
Yeah, and we discover that Gilead has probably faded from history. That it doesn't seem like it is in existence anymore, and that what we've been reading is in fact an academic paper that these 2 professors have discovered some tapes that on which Offred's tale was recounted, and her tale is very cleverly hidden. There's sort of music for 3 or 4 tracks, and then her voice comes in. So they have to reconstruct it, they have to transcribe it, and then there's a whole bunch of wonderful academic wondering about what has happened to this character, which is the same thing that we are going through. And so there's just this great authorial sleight of hand that I'm not I believe it works, and I think we're probably going to talk about it. But I wonder if it could have worked better without this authorial sleight of hand. I'm really interested to talk about how much it adds and how much it subtracts.
It's on my list of things to talk about as well.
But yeah,
I have mixed feelings about the epilogue.
Me too, which I think pre-drink everybody. I think it's intentional. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, my co-host, Chris Bagg.
He'll be here until we kick him out. The academics also don't really know what's happened to Offred. They speculate that maybe she did escape to England, maybe she was recaptured. A whole bunch of terrible things could have happened to her, or good things.
Well, and specifically, the reason they don't know is because the tapes were found within the boundaries of Gilead in Bangor, Maine, specifically, which is close.
So close
to the border, but not out. And so one is left to conclude that she made these tapes when she was on part of the Underground Female Road on a stop, waiting for passage, across the border. Well, yeah, let's get into it.
Totally. Yeah. So my question for you, like last time we talked about the slowness of the plot of this novel, and both of us were like, yeah, it really feels like it's about to kick off. And I was wondering what your experience, do you feel like the second half of the novel, did it feel more heavily plotted than the first half of the novel?
It does feel more heavily plotted. I think because a number of things that have been set up either come to fruition or collapse. I think my question, which maybe I'll get to later, I think I'll save it, is whether all of those plot devices are crafty or are they the result of a absolutely brilliant creator of a scenario getting in a bit too deep and needing to resolve it. Something you might call a sort of Jordaning, or a Martining of the loose ends.
A Stevensoning.
A Stevensoning to some degree, right? Certainly, a Cryptonomiconian. A sort of shaftoing the narrative. What I'm getting at here is that there's a lot of plot.
A Gatelying.
Yes.
An incredenzaing, though maybe not. I'm not sure.
Incondensing. Which is similar to a shaftoing, because shafto gets incondensed and incondensa gets shafted.
Shaftoed.
Wow. This is our version of hip-hop.
This is our version of hip-hop.
And nobody cares but me and you.
I know. You need what is the hip-hop song of Jesse and Chris? It involves baseball, Maine, hiking, 20th and 19th century literature, primarily American, but some other stuff too.
I think this is the hip hop song of Jesse and Chris. I think that is actually what this podcast is. It just needs to be remixed.
I can't wait.
By the way, you said baseball, so we get an organ, right?
Yep.
Da 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 da. Dun, 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 dun. There is more plot. I have questions about whether some of it is clumsy. Actually, you know what? It leads into my second question, so I'll go into that, which is, okay, Jezebel's is a great set piece.
Oh my God, so good.
It's a great set piece, and it's very entertaining to read, and it's also, I think, narratively satisfying, because you're like, I knew it! Gilead's a bunch of hypocrites.
Right,
and the powerful men
of course.
Are behaving, well, of course or not of course. I mean, I think there's a part of me that's like, I don't know, I think that people of all political stripes tend to assume that the other side secretly knows that they're wrong, but they're just hypocrites. I think that's something that progressives think about conservatives, and that's why there's a lot of talk of gaslighting, etc. And I think that's something especially like deep conservatives think about. Sort of the anti-wokeness crusade right now is kind of, and I think that in many cases they're wrong, and sometimes even though there is hypocrisy, they actually are up against true believers.
Yeah.
And so in a way, I wondered if, even though Jezebel's is very satisfying and it's like, aha, maybe would it be more interesting if the commander and the leaders of Gilead were more consistent about their own, in my opinion, very wrong-brained beliefs? You know, would that be more interesting? Because is it a little bit cheap to just be like, you know what, deep down, this is just about power, like everything else?
Well, I think he does actually. I think he is a true believer because he does say at a certain point in there, I mean, like, I love the point you're bringing up that like hypocrisy is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
It's in like, which is such an incredible point. And like, I think that anybody that has had the experience of discovering that their previous point of view was incorrect has a very odd relationship with that realization, because it's less about knowing that you were incorrect and more about just a blind spot that ran your life. Like you literally couldn't see it another way. And the commander says, it's a club, I say. Well, that's what we call it among ourselves, the club. I thought this sort of thing was strictly forbidden, I say. Well, officially, he says, but everyone's human after all. I wait for him to elaborate on this, but he doesn't. So I say, what does that mean? It means you can't cheat nature, he says. Nature demands variety for men. It stands to reason. It's part of the procreational strategy. It's nature's plan. I don't say anything, so he goes on. Way to go, Margaret Atwood. Women know that instinctively. Why did they buy so many different clothes in the old days? To trick the men into thinking they were several different women, a new one each day. I think he does believe. I think and there is another point in here about his power.
There's a moment where he says that people who are above reproach can be tolerated. Exceptions can be made for people who are above reproach.
Yeah. Yeah. And so he's both conscious of his hypocrisy, but believes that he deserves it, which is the sort of like, therein lies the human condition that puts governing systems like this out of reach of humans. You know, the standard rap on communism is like, oh, well, it's just not in our nature to be able to pull that off. We're too greedy, which like, I think is like that's just sort of like a rhetorical talking point on the side of capitalism. Yeah, it's a cop-out, and it fuels it fuels capitalism's own sort of like devouring of like, and I think that's what's going on here, is that these authoritarian structures are inherently hypocritical because absolute power corrupts absolutely. Yeah. And so I think one of the really great things that Margaret Atwood pulls off here is that she makes the hypocrisy sensible. And that's what's so scary about, and like, you know, we talked about The Bluest Eye and like whether you would teach it to young adults. And like my reason for like, I don't think this is a book that we should teach to people who are unprepared, is that in the wrong hands, like without context, without perspective, without the sense of history, and we see this all the time, right? Like we see this in people who play jokes, and then the jokes become real conspiracies. Right. The birds aren't real conspiracy, which is a fake conspiracy theory that is now being believed by a certain percentage of the people who are exposed to it. And I think she is just so brilliantly, she's sort of taken like Orwell's brilliance of 1984 and like put more emotion in it.
Well, but I mean, I guess if I were transported to Gilead and given a, diplomatic immunity such that I could argue with the commander without fear of being imprisoned, I would say to him, but maybe you're right, but doesn't that undermine the entire structure that you've set up where you're controlling everybody's sexual activity? Essentially, you're saying this exception is okay for me, it's not okay for everybody else, but you're asking everybody else to live under the structure that you yourself has just said is unnatural and that you can't cheat nature. And you're trying to get them to do it just through sheer authoritarianism, you know? And I mean, how would you ever expect to have any true believers when you obviously, I would argue, are not really a true believer because you've said the condition that you require for everybody else is not realistic for a human. You just happen to have the power to be able to cheat that condition. Yeah. And I don't know how that holds up. I mean, to me, I agree. I agree that Atwood seems to conclude that he is a true believer and that this cognitive dissonance is something that people with a lot of power tend to be able to do. Mm-hmm. But I also, it made me wonder. I was like, are there brothels like this in, Saudi Arabia or North Korea? Maybe North Korea, because that's more of a state dictatorship rather than a religious dictatorship. I don't know. It just made me want, because I do know what I would describe as very conservative Christians who are not authoritarian, who believe in live and let live, but who would say the healthiest way to live is in monogamy and having lots of children, and we're not going to have sex except for in the context of marriage, except for in a commitment that we make for the rest of our lives. If somebody dies, perhaps you can find a new partner, but apart from that, this is the healthiest way to structure society. And I know people like this who I think, unless they are very, very, very hypocritical and secretive, don't cheat. They impose this discipline that many people would consider unnatural on themselves and seem to gain some kind of, there's a simplicity to the structure of their lives that I think mitigates a lot of the anxieties that us seculars have to manage. That's not to say I would trade places with them. I don't think I would, because I think there's a giving up of too much freedom. But I think, so I don't know. It just would be interesting to me to imagine a Gilead run by people who adhere to their own values. Yeah. And that might be an even more horrifying book.
I wonder if the horror of the book is that, like, they are living by their own values, but their value system is basically it's an I'm above the law. Like it's a value system that sees no humanity in anyone but the self.
Did you notice that one of the biblical quotes is fake biblical quotes is from each according to her ability, to each according to his need.
Yes.
Which listeners is, I believe, a quote from either Marx or Engels, which is butchered by the Republic of Gilead. And I mean, I think this is a feminist critique of any patriarchal society that, I think Atwood's point is there really aren't values. There is really just a hierarchy. And at the top of that hierarchy is powerful white men. Yeah. And that's it. And then slightly lower down from the powerful white men are less powerful white men, the angels, who, if they fight really hard and they're lucky, might get to become one of the powerful white men. And then a little bit farther down from them are the wives, who have attached themselves to powerful white men, who have it a little bit better than any other women, and etc. And that, that her theory here, and again, I think this gets to my point about hypocrisy and how we tend to see hypocrisy, is there is no ideology. It is only structure. Yeah. It is the structure is the ideology.
Yeah, l'état c'est moi. Like that's where that comes from. Like that's the idea is that like it isn't an animating belief structure. It's simply like Gilead is essentially capitalism run through a patriarchal pyramid. Like what you just described. There is some space for some upward mobility for some parts of society, and that stands on top of this sort of endlessly churning sea of women, basically, who are still responsible for moving, you know, the world forward, but the only people with any mobility are men. And it is run through this like weirdly capitalistic, like if we do well enough and we get ahead, then we're given our reward. And you're right. It is a deeply cynical point of view about humankind. But I also think given what we see in the world, like it's not generally true, but it is certainly, there are certainly specific parts of history and the present day where it is definitely true.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And Atwood has done her homework, you know, and the point that she makes the Studs Terkel is there is not a single element in this book that is not derivative of some moment in history or another.
Yeah. I've got a reading about falling in love that I really liked. And this is during the wedding. And it's sort of interspersed with the recollection of trying to get away. And also a continuing discussion with the commander. I mean, this is what I love about this section, is that it just jumps and it really feels poetic. And we know Margaret Atwood does write poetry, and there were sections of this book that really felt to me like this big, rambling, lyrical poem, and I just loved it. So, love, said the commander. That's better. That's something I know about. We can talk about that. Falling in love, I said. Falling into it, we all did then, one way or another. How could he have made such light of it? Sneered even, as if it was trivial for us, a frill, a whim. It was, on the contrary, heavy going. It was the central thing. It was the way you understood yourself. If it never happened to you, not ever, you would be like a mutant, a creature from outer space. Everyone knew that. Falling in love, we said. I fell for him. We were falling women. We believed in it, this downward motion. So lovely, like flying. And yet at the same time so dire, so extreme, so unlikely. God is love, they once said. But we reversed that. And love, like heaven, was always just around the corner. The more difficult it was to love the particular man beside us, the more we believed in love, abstract and total. We were waiting always for the incarnation, the Word made flesh. And sometimes it happened for a time. That kind of love comes and goes and is hard to remember afterwards, like pain. You would look at the man one day and you would think, I loved you. And the tense would be past, and you would be filled with a sense of wonder, because it was such an amazing and precarious and dumb thing to have done. And you would know, too, why your friends had been evasive about it at the time.
Margaret Atwood is so cynical sometimes.
I know. I'm going to quote my high school English teacher, Diane Leahy, here. We had just read Adrienne Rich's amazing poem, Living in Sin, which is a very cynical, very sad poem about like how awful it is to be in love. And somebody in class said, I think she's just a grumpy old lady. And without a beat, Miss Leahy went, well then, so am I.
You know what? I want to, I'm just imagining, I think I know why you would describe Gilead as capitalistic, but I'm imagining somebody who is more of an apologist or defender of capitalism who would listen to you say that and be like, this is the least capitalistic thing I could ever imagine. There's no private ownership of property. There's no freedom to accept employment. In fact, of all the society has ever seen, this resembles communist China or the communist Soviet Union more than any other economic structure. The economy is centrally planned. The only way that anybody gains status is working through the government. Nobody starts a business. The businesses are controlled by the government. Why, Chris Bagg, is this then capitalism?
Well, I think, this is a cynicism of mine, but like, I believe that large monolithic structures like capitalism, like communism, and communism is different from socialism, everybody, come on. But not that socialism is successful either, but I really do believe that when you get these belief structures and political structures going on a large enough scale, they inevitably become structures of control. And that happens in our society in terms of inequality. And that eventually that the structures are just as rigid as they might be, and not just as rigid as, say, like, the Soviet Union in, say, like 1959 would have been a particularly miserable place to live.
Right.
But I think when we see the excesses of capitalism, like, sort of spun out over the next 50 years, and we're looking at the hellscape of the environment that is likely to result from that capitalism, like, is that any better? Like, is the freedom to make a business, like, useful if, like, you can't go outside? I'm sitting inside right now with the windows drawn and the air conditioner not on because I'm recording this podcast because it's 102 degrees outside. And like, I see large monolithic political structures as eventually becoming rigid and hypocritical because that's really the only way to make them keep working. We got to see this during the pandemic. You take the blood out of the body, it dies in weeks. like you take the blood out of capitalism, it doesn't stay alive on the table.
It's interesting that, because I guess what I would say that, to me, the word wouldn't necessarily be capitalism per se. It's more the tendency of any ideological system to become oligarchical or to become seized by oligarchs. Because I think there are healthy governments that have economic systems that actually blend socialism and capitalism pretty effectively, like, say, Germany or Sweden or Norway, or even the UK, even though it's kind of a mess, or even France, even though it's kind of a mess, or even Canada, which is kind of a mess, which to me, all of those economies are interesting hybrids of socialism and capitalism with sort of capitalism segments. And I think they work not necessarily because of those economic systems, one being necessarily better than the other, but because they have a political culture that is more or less functional. That there's still a kind of general sense of we're all in this together, that America has kind of lost.
Yeah, absolutely.
But anyway, that's a digression. Here's the question I wanted to ask you relative to the novel was, you asked me about plot earlier, and I was talking about how I thought there was a lot more plot in the second half, but I also wondered if some of the plot was clumsy or heavy-handed. And so I wanted to ask you about, what do you think about the plot device that leads to Offred's escape, at least from this situation?
It feels rushed. The end of the book feels sketchy. And you do get the sense of an incredibly, like, I'm not even going to say talented, because it's not just talent. It's talent and skill and craft and practice. She's incredible. She's an incredible writer.
And this is something like her 20th novel at this point, and I think she's written roughly 20 since then too, as well as several poetry collections and short story collections.
Yeah, she's one of those people who just can't help herself. She just keeps writing. The end of the book feels a little sketchy, like the detail of the Pravaganza, the Jezebel visit, and the Partisecution. I mean, those 3 set pieces are so well rendered.
Yeah.
And we do move into this period where, like, the affair with Nick, it's not dispensed with, and she even calls attention to it, where she's like, that's not what happened. That's not what happened. That's it. Like, she's leaning into the sketchiness and the sort of like pulling away of detail, but it really feels like the novel is the right length. And so I have this like sense of Margaret Atwood perhaps like struggling with this moment and being like, no, it's the right length. I've got to wrap it up. Like, how am I going to get her out of here? And it feels a little too neat. You know, there's this confrontation with Serena, the commander's there, Ofglen has just been disappeared. It just happens really fast.
I mean, I would say the classic, modern novel critique of it is it's something of a Deus ex machina, too.
Yeah, totally.
That Offred doesn't do anything, arguably, to affect her own escape. And in fact, I was thinking about this. Offred's not really a very good protagonist in the 19th and 20th century novel sense.
Is she another of our passive protagonists?
I think she is.
Yeah.
I think that Moira and Ofglen are that kind of protagonist.
Yeah.
And this is like, we might be doing a little role reversal here, because this might actually be intentional. I think part of what Margaret Atwood is telling us, or at least the metafictional logic of Offred, who is, of those 3 women, is the one who does the least to sort of change and grow and survive, being the one who escapes. I think she's telling us that we're in a world where individual action doesn't matter a whole lot, and that the institutions are more powerful, and really the only thing that's going to get an individual out is luck.
Yeah.
And ultimately she's lucky. And I want to read a passage, unless you want to comment on that before.
No,
because I have a passage to support.
I agree with you, because I think what she's doing, and this is what you do. This is generally what you do, right? You situate your major point within your major character,
and your narrative structure, right?
And I think the point that Margaret Atwood is making is about the general slide towards complicity, and Offred even points out that she is complicit in deaths. And she thinks about burning the house down. She doesn't. She thinks about hanging herself on the coat hook. She doesn't. And she is making her peace with the little piece that she has, like this connection with Nick. She basically gives up on her daughter, and and kind of begins that devastating, cynical slide towards acceptance of this horrible thing. And so I think you're right. I think it is intentional. And in some ways, her getting escaped is not what she wants at that particular moment.
Well, maybe at that particular moment it is, but like it is, it's not, I mean, the section that I've pulled, I think, speaks directly to this. So this is the beginning of chapter 41. And she says, I wish this story were different. I wish it were more civilized. She goes on about this for a little bit, a couple paragraphs, and then she says, I've tried to put some of the good things in as well. Flowers, for instance, because where would we be without them? Nevertheless, it hurts me to tell it over again. Once was enough. Wasn't once enough for me at the time? But I keep on going with this sad and hungry and sordid, this limping and mutilated story. Because after all, I want you to hear it, as I will hear yours, too, if I ever get the chance. If I meet you, or if you escape, in the future, or in heaven, or in prison, or underground, some other place. What they have in common is they are not here. by telling you anything at all, at least I'm believing in you. I believe you're there. I believe you into being. Because I'm telling you this story. I will your existence. I tell, therefore you are. So I will go on. So I will myself to go on. I am coming to a part you will not like at all. Because in it I did not behave well. But I will try nonetheless to leave nothing out. After all you've been through, you deserve whatever I have left, which is not much, but includes the truth. And then that's when she tells us that she takes up with Nick and starts the memory of her daughter and the memory of her husband start fading a bit. She feels guilty about it. She feels guilty because it feels like a betrayal of Luke, even though Luke is possibly likely dead. Feels like a betrayal of her daughter. Feels like a betrayal of Glenn and the resistance. And she knows, on some level, she thinks like, I wish I was somebody who was spying on the command. The resistance asks her to spy on the commander. And she's like, no, I'm not the right person for that.
Yeah.
I don't think I could. And, so yeah, it's interesting. And I think, there's two things I see going on here too. And I think one thing is, we're seeing Offred at her worst, but the one quality she has that is completely redemptive is a commitment to truth.
Yeah.
And I think to some degree, Margaret Atwood is saying the truth will set us free, will save us. I also think she's saying there's nothing individuals can do in a situation like that, which is kind of, and I say this without celebration or judgment, it's kind of a marker of the political left, that individuals can resist, but only collectively can we overcome.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, all of these people have very, very limited power. They can resist, but it's kind of like we're going back to Greek tragedy, where it doesn't matter how heroic you are. Moira's heroic. What happens to her? Ovglen is heroic. What happens to her? Offred is the least heroic, and she's the one who escapes. I mean, this is Nietzsche's point in The Birth of Tragedy, too, which is it doesn't matter what you do. The gods are too powerful.
Right.
And in this case, the gods are the institution. So in this case, I think that that's the logic behind what I find to be a kind of unsatisfying narrative choice. But I think I've talked myself into it working. I think that we get a Deus ex machina in this book because this is a book about Deus, about, and not actual God, but the sort of godlike institutions that humans create and the machinas that those institutions create.
And the passage that I just read is like, she says that like God is love, but we turned it around and we made love God, you know? And so like the same movement is happening there. And I think, like we should get to the epilogue because I think the epilogue, which is kind of
it's an
additional machina.
It is. I think of the epilogue as like, okay, Margaret Atwood, you were a very good girl and you didn't say all the things you wanted to say and you were thinking for like 300 pages. So it's kind of like David Foster Wallace's footnotes. Like, okay, like she's just got to have a steam valve and she's got to let us know a little bit about what she's thinking. And she's also got to put some irony and some, because the epilogue is funny.
It's funny
in a way that the book, and I think the humor has a purpose. I think she's mocking the ways in which academics sort of cultural relativity can flatten human experience, right? And all these academics are like, we're not here to judge the Gileads,
we're not here to censure, but to record like that.
To understand, right? And, after hearing Offred's tale, that feels damn callous. Of course, it's 150 years later, and I think academics would argue that the point of that kind of detachment is not to be callous. The point of it is that if you're judging, that judging interferes with understanding. But in that moment, she's taking them to task.
Well, I'm sort of building off of what you just said about like Moira and Offglen are heroic and Offred is the least heroic. But, what the epilogue shows us is that Gilead does not go on.
Right.
We don't have an idea of how long or how, like, we get some ideas about Middle Gilead, and we know that the period when Offred is relating is early Gilead.
Well, she remembers the very beginning.
Yeah, the very beginning of it, and the commander is purged at some point.
Yeah.
But I think what the point that's being made here is that, and it's not, this is not a deep point or anything like that, but that revolution takes different forms.
Right.
There are the people who are directly heroic. There are your Ofglins and your Nicks and your Moiras that really, at great personal risk to themselves, resist overtly, or as overtly as they can. And then you have recorders. You have people that preserve the stories of what it was like.
Yeah.
And that, like, Offred is kind of recording this story for Luke. Like, that's the sense, is that's, in heaven or in prison or somewhere. She's apologizing to him. But that what the epilogue shows us is that even if we are feeling ambivalent about the way that Offred gets out, and even if she is feeling ambivalent about it, that the arc of history does bend mostly away from authoritarianism, because it's just so damn hard to sustain.
It's true that most authoritarian regimes are not long for this world.
Yeah.
Now, that said, most functional democratic republics are also not long for this world, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's
not a nova sub soul, or whatever the expression is. The other thing too, and I think if we're being really analytical, I think part of the reason we see Offred as less heroic is because Offred's superpower, and the thing that does make her heroic, is truth-telling.
Yeah.
And she turns that power upon herself.
Yeah.
And so it is both narratively unsatisfying, but, if you think about it, she actually does take action in her. What's the one action that she's most ashamed of?
Nick.
Is starting the affair with Nick and kind of giving up on her hopes. Why does Nick rescue her?
Because he loves her.
Right. And maybe because he thinks she has his baby, we're told. Yeah. So actually, maybe the thing she does that is what she considers to be the least heroic is actually the action that she takes as the protagonist to get her out of this predicament. And she follows her instincts. She's not particularly monogamous. She's not particularly virtuous. I think that's very Margaret Atwood too.
Yeah.
Right. But it's interesting. It's something that maybe even the commander would agree with, right? You can't repress nature.
Yeah. It's a novel about complication. Like, right. I think if you eventually step back from it, we talked last time about the number of the times that the word circumstances comes up.
Yeah.
And like, circumstances is a phrase that people use when they're trying to say it's complicated. When they're like, like circumstances and
context.
Right, context. And I think, like, that's why this novel is satisfying and unsatisfying and clear and unclear and prose and poetry. And like, it is, and I think that the epilogue has a real cousin in the framing device from Lolita. That this entire account is simply, the like mad pennings of this crazed Humbert, who, by the way, passed away a couple days ago, and we've got this book. Isn't this great? In the same sort of academic tone of voice of this, like, this thing that is treated coolly, that is like an absolute, like, horror show. And I think that, like, way to go, Margaret Atwood, like writes herself into, like, the literary, firmament along with Nabokov, which is, like, she deserves it. Like, that's where she is.
Yeah. And I think ultimately, I think one is tempted to say the epilogue is an indulgence, and I think it sort of is, but it does lead, because it almost feels like it's of a different piece, right? It's like you're looking at a marble statuary and then the eye is made out of ruby, and you're like, really? You know, like there's something off about it.
Yeah,
It's off in tone, it's off in many respects, but it does make you think.
It's Liberace's piano.
Right. It does.
It's too much.
I think it appears to be too much at first, but in the end, I think it's also serving a purpose and it's undergirding the argument. So I think in the end, as an editor, I'd be like, do we really need this epilogue? And I think, no, but I don't hate it. And I actually think ultimately it does aid the book. In a way, you'd have a more elegant creation without it, but this is also a novel of ideas, right?
Yeah.
And it serves those ideas, and I think I'm okay with it.
Yeah, I think it would be. I think you're right. That's a nice way of putting it. That it would be a little. It would be. I don't know. I was just about to ask. I was just about to read you the final 2 paragraphs and be like, "Does this work?" And I think it does. But the epilogue does add this sense of like the way that like history's ripples continue to like move outward, and. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is a weirdness, but it does something. It does something to the book that I think elevates it further. Maybe it's a little
like the beauty mark on Madonna's chin.
Yes, exactly. I mean, like we can't top that. So let's go to trivia.
You don't want to read the last 2 graphs?
No, I don't. Well, yeah, sure. Why don't we do it for let's leave this question standing open for our readers.
Okay.
The van waits in the driveway. Its double doors stand open. The 2 of them, one on either side now, take me by the elbows to help me in. Whether this is my end or a new beginning, I have no way of knowing. I have given myself over into the hands of strangers because it can't be helped. And so I step up into the darkness within, or else the light.
I think it would have been a perfectly great ending.
I think it would have.
And I think that I would have assumed that she escaped because we're reading the account. Mm-hmm. I think I would have assumed that she got away because the story is told in the past tense. And I mean, the other thing I'll note too is that in the first half of the book, and maybe it's because I remembered reading it, but I actually think there are enough plot clues that Nick is in the underground.
Yeah.
If nothing else, we know that there probably is a spy in the commander's household because Glenn knows all these things about that household. And really, the only way you would do it is if you had a spy. Okay, it could be Serena, seems unlikely. Could be one of the 2 Marthas, seems quite unlikely. I think the Marthas are drawn a little too stereotypically for my taste, by the way. But Nick is the obvious choice.
Yeah.
And so that the idea that he was actually both an eye and also a spy, I think that was properly foreshadowed. But I still think it's Deus Ex Machina a little bit, even though I've justified it. Yeah,
I mean, like, I think it would have been perfectly satisfying. But what I like about the epilogue is that, like, so we finish the main plot and we think she's getting away. Like, that's what it feels like. And so it feels satisfying. And the epilogue is, yes, full of like Margaret Atwood can't help poking fun at, you know, the way that academics can flatten history. But also, like, we learn that it's like just as fucking complicated. We have no idea if she got out. And so it's sort of like where this like positive ending is dangled for us. It's dangled ambivalently. Like my
and
end
the
or my
ambivalence remains. Right. In the epilogue. And I think that is a strength of the epilogue. It would be weaker
great restraint
as an ending.
Yes.
Yeah. I think there's a restraint. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And yeah, it would be weaker to say, even though some part of this would make my heart warm. Oh yes, this of course is the narrative of June, who settled in England and lived a long life and had many children. You'd be like, okay, good for her. You know, it would have been great if like Luke was waiting for her on the other side of the river, but like, you know, it's not that kind of story.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like Margaret Atwood is like, save the cat. Ha.
Yeah.
I'm going to make the cat's life is always
the last we see of the
danger.
cat is on a canoe, mewling helplessly, floating towards the falls.
Yeah.
And yet, there are some rocks that, if the cat is very agile, it might be able to leap to the shore.
The canoe will crush the cat against the rocks.
Right. I don't know if I entirely buy Margaret Atwood's worldview. I think she's very, very smart and very, very learned and erudite. But I'm certainly enriched by being immersed in it. And I certainly tip my hat to her ability to write a novel of ideas that is so creepy, so readable, so terrifying, and so entertaining all at once.
I think it's one of my favorite things that we've read. Like I am really enjoying this experience of like hitting the books that I should have read in like high school or early college. Like this is the disservice of AP exams, is that you get to skip some stuff that later you're like, fuck, I didn't want to skip that.
Shall we move on to trivia?
Let's move on to trivia. I believe you went first last time, so I'm going to take it.
Yep.
Okay, so The Handmaid's Tale has been adapted most recently for television, as we know, but it has been shifted into almost every other genre over the years. There was a film, there was an opera, there was a stage play, there is a ballet, there is a radio play of it, which I would really like to hear.
That sounds great.
I know, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The film version came out in 1990 and was pretty universally panned. And it was supposed to star which of the following A-list actors before she had to be replaced, ironically, because she got pregnant? Was it A, Sigourney Weaver, B, Diana Rigg, or C, Zoe Wanamaker?
I'm not picturing Zoe Wanamaker. I feel like Sigourney. It's interesting because I don't think she would be a good choice. I think she comes across as too confident for Offred, but that was the era when Sigourney got cast in this kind of thing. But you know what? I'm just going to say B, Diana Rigg.
Oh, it was Sigourney Weaver.
Ow!
Yes,
I feel like she's too. She just like kicked the commander in the balls.
Yeah,
and,
right.
Like, steal his car. You know,
she comes in with a flamethrower.
Yeah,
like, come on, you motherfucker!
Come on, we're getting out of here.
That would be
hijacks
awesome.
the private eye car.
Oh, what if The Handmaid's Tale and the end of Aliens got smashed together? That'd be great.
Yeah, she gets in the loader and destroys the house using the loader.
She
from
picks
the end
up
of
one of the
Aliens.
vans and throws it into the house, and like pinches Serena Joy's head off with one of the claspers,
the little grabbers. Yeah.
No, she was replaced by Natasha Richardson. I just couldn't resist putting Diana Rigg, one of the great Bond girls, as Offred. And Zoe Wanamaker felt young in the 80s and 90s and British, and so I felt like that would have been a fair
it's funny because like I was sure one of them was going to be Meryl Streep. I was like, of course they would want Meryl Streep as Offred. Of course.
Yeah, that would have been the right time for that too. She would have been perfect for it at that age.
Yeah. But I guess not. Yeah, I would imagine Sigourney as Moira. Okay. The color coding of the different categories of women, wives, Marthas, handmaids, aunts, that was inspired by a couple of different sources. And one of the sources, according to Margaret Atwood, were the actual New England Puritans, who apparently did a version of that. But the other inspiration was the 16th century Italian sumptuary laws, according to Margaret Atwood. Now, I had never heard of the 16th century sumptuary laws, so I did a little bit of research. And it turns out that sumptuary laws are a category of laws that govern how different people of different genders and social classes can dress. And they've existed many places throughout the years. including pre-revolutionary France, where they inspired the ire of a certain French philosopher.
Oh, God.
I'm going to read what this French philosopher wrote about the sumptuary laws, and then I'll give you the chance to guess which philosopher wrote that, and it'll be multiple choice.
Okay, thank God.
So this philosopher writes, "The way by which our laws attempt to regulate idle and vain expenses in meat and clothes seems to be quite contrary to the end designed. For to enact that none but princes shall eat turbot, shall wear velvet or gold lace, and interdict these things to the people, what is it but to bring them into a greater esteem, and to set every one more agog to eat and wear them?"
You said
Okay.
16th century French sumptuary laws?
No, pre-revolutionary. Pre-revolution. The 16th century Italian sumptuary laws.
Okay.
So these laws could be any... In France, the clue I gave you is this is pre-revolution.
Okay, got it. Okay.
Do you need to hear the quote again before you get the choices?
No, I think I got the flavor of it. We're gonna see if I can pin it to a particular philosopher.
Right. Is the philosopher who wrote those words A, René Descartes, B, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, C, Michel de Montaigne, or D, Laurent de Nivin?
Amazing. Laurent. Never has his name sounded so good. Laurent de Nivin. I love it.
Hopefully he loves it too.
Fuck. I don't think it's Montaigne. It feels too in your face to be Montaigne. And it doesn't feel circumspect enough to be Descartes. I'm going to go with Rousseau.
It's a good guess, but it was Montaigne.
No shit. Wow.
Yeah. Which, like, if you've read Montaigne, he does digress a lot. And just like this thinker who's writing meditations on the nature of, epistemology, how we know what we know.
Yeah.
Would certainly like just start writing about the sumptuary laws.
Yeah.
But it also does feel like Rousseau. I agree, because Rousseau is kind of a whiner.
Yeah, it's got that in your face quality of Rousseau.
Yeah.
That
Stupid laws. Man wasn't meant to follow laws.
This is another throwback. I mean, I'm really hitting my
they
high
make
school
sense.
teachers these days today. But my great visual arts teacher, Mr. Hayes, always referred to René Descartes as Rini Descartes. And then Magritte got the same. Rini Magritte was his other.
Rini Magritte. Yeah, I was thinking about how to be is almost or always a transitive verb. You have to be something.
Yeah.
But there are two famous examples of to be being used as an intransitive verb, and one is Descartes and the other is Shakespeare.
Right.
Yeah. That came up funny in a Twitter thread. There's a podcast called Why Are Dads, and that's the name of the podcast. And I for some reason I pointed out that this was an ungrammatical statement and got into a kind of a long, friendly Twitter argument with a bunch of people about whether "why are dads" is a question or not. And somebody was arguing that "to be" was being used in the intransitive sense. So why do dads exist, essentially, is the question.
Why are dads? Yeah.
Whereas I was saying, no,
yeah.
this is a dependent clause. We need an adjective or a noun or a
why are dads blank?
Yes.
What's the Descartes "to be" phrase?
I think, therefore I am.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Jesus. I guess I might have gotten there eventually that's Descartes, but I don't know where I would have attributed that.
Cogito ergo sum. I think that's the two things I know about Descartes is that he said that and he came up with the grid.
Yes, yeah. The good old Cartesian plane. This was a really fun discussion.
Capitalism. Intransitive versions of 2B.
My high school art faculty was fucking amazing.
Yeah.
Like I'm just like thinking about that now, just like,
Rennie McGrady.
Yeah, my visual art teacher cracking wise about like French philosophers and artists.
Rennie McGrady sounds like somebody you'd meet like in a bar in Lewiston, Maine.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Because there's a little like it's like French, but it's been like thoroughly
it's been Americanized,
like not even anglicized.
And like the mother was French, but the father was Irish.
Yeah.
Rennie McGrady, get over here. This guy thinks he can beat you at Big Buck Hunter. That was a deep cut.
Yep.
Chris Bagg, will you read The Handmaid's Tale again?
I don't think so. I think I really went for it on this one. I really luxuriated in it. I listened to it. I like really got into the text of it. Like I really marked it up. I'm really happy with the way that it hews to and departs from the show. I feel like I get the craft. I don't think it's something that's like emulatable. like insofar as like, sure, maybe if you like write all the time and like, think about big ideas a lot, maybe in 30 years you have a chance at writing a few sentences like Margaret Atwood. But yeah, I really think it's a really remarkable achievement, but I don't think I need to read it again. How about you?
I think I will read it again. And one is that I just think it reads well.
Yeah.
So like, even though it makes me anxious and I'm like worried that I'm going to wake up and we'll be closer to her reality, I also think it's a book that is interesting. I don't know that I'll read it again in like a year. I think maybe 10, 15. I think I read it about 15 years ago and I could see reading it in 15 years. But as a writer, yeah, I agree that there's a certain poeticness to her language that I don't think I could ever emulate. But the thing I think I could maybe study in her writing is the time shifting and the montage, the way that she will use memory to nestle scenes of the past, the present, the near present. Just how many times does Offred see something in the present, think about the red center, and then think about the before times, and then comment on that thing that she's seen, and then go back and forth. I mean, the excerpt I read last time had a few examples of that as well. And I think there's a very specific inspiration. It also is relevant to me as a radio producer because I think or as a screenwriter, that how to use montage in a way that doesn't feel jarring is I think there's a lot to learn from that. So I think I will.
Yeah, I think you put your finger really nicely on the thing that I want to learn from this book. Yeah, like that sort of brilliant associative drifting that still manages to hang together. This book is it's like a brilliant souffle.
Yeah, somehow her narrative is lighter than air, right? It's just light enough to lift a balloon into the air, and you're like, there's nothing in that balloon, and you're like, you don't need anything.
Well, like so many narratives of like authoritarianism or like absurdism have that same quality of like, there's nothing here, like it's just it's the emperor has no clothes, and yet and so it is like a novel of like empty ideas that like destroy a continent, which is like very, very scary.
And it's like, how often do you get something like rubbing the butter or the grease from the lanolin from the wool?
Yeah.
Or, how many of the scenes are so naturalistic, which I think we also see in Octavia Butler. We also see in The Bluest Eye, the dandelions, like just the way in which the naturalism transports you right into the moment. Like when I was reading this, there's this sense of like, hyper-realism.
Yeah.
Like, I kind of remember what it was like to live in Gilead. I never lived in Gilead. But it's part of it is that it does also remind me of the 80s, which I also remember sort of distantly. So my memory of the 80s and Gilead gets sort of mixed up together. But, well, what's next, Chris?
Let's see. Next, we are going to be reading Ray Bradbury's iconic and eternal book, Fahrenheit 451. It's our meta book. It's about burning books in our banned books series, which is going to be awesome.
There's probably some Fahrenheit 451 in The Handmaid's Tale, too, I think. Imagine that's in the DNA.
Well, thank you for listening, everybody, and I'm going to kick it back over to Dukes to read the credits.
Upper Middle Brow is a Small Point production. Chris Bagg and Jesse Dukes are the underground Quakers, leading you to freedom. Music by Ben Pajak and Jesse Dukes. Design and website by Chris Bagg. You can learn more about us and find our listener survey at uppermiddlebrow.com. Please review us in your podcast app so other people can find the show and we can feel good about ourselves.
I wonder what tyranny we are leading people from. That is what
the tyranny of illiteracy.
And speaking of that, we can lead you from your own tyranny of illiteracy, folks. So for those of you out there that are illiterate but are penning a work that needs editing.
Or semi-literate.
Jesse and I are both writers and editors, and we can help you with your writing, podcasting, or editing project. You can see some of our portfolios and learn more at our respective websites, chrisbagg.com and jessedukes.com. Come on by and let us know if we can help you out. But in the meantime, thank you so much for listening, everybody.
Good night, folks.